Colorado Springs is home to a large military population. Over 40,000 serve at one of the area's 5 bases, making it the region's largest employer. Many who serve live off base in large apartment units. One of those is U.S. Army Specialist Tracy Spencer. On the morning of July 19th, 1986, Tracy needs a ride from his apartment to his post on Fort Carson. He knocks on a neighbor's door, hoping to catch a ride. But his friend isn't home. Tracy walks away, but his eye catches something strange in another unit.
He had walked to a neighbor's apartment. That neighbor wasn't at home. He walked back towards his own apartment, glanced in a neighbor's window, saw what appeared to be a body on the floor.
Tracy rushes to get help.
Tracy Spencer saw this and then went down to his apartment and got his wife to go back up with him. And then she actually entered the apartment by removing a screen and going through a window. She discovered the body that was on the floor in the bedroom between the bed and a wall. And then at that point, they called 911.
Within minutes, detectives arrive in the apartment belonging to 22-year-old Mickey Fillmore. It's clear the victim is dead.
The initial indication in the apartment was first that there did not seem to be any real obvious signs of struggle. However, it did appear that the victim possibly had some bruising in the throat area, and she was naked at the time and actually on the floor on top of some clothes. Because we had the victim being found naked, there's the initial suspicion that perhaps there was a sexual assault involved in the death.
The coroner makes an initial determination regarding the cause of death.
The body of Mickey Fillmore was found with bruising and scratches on the neck. She's got bruising of what we call the strap muscles, which are the muscles of the neck that allow you to move your head back and forth and nod yes or no. She also has some bleeding around the hyoid bone that lives high up in the neck. Injuries to both of these areas are very typical of strangulation deaths.
And so at this point, we began our investigation believing that this would be a homicide case.
As head of the Major Crimes Unit, Lt.Joe Kenda now takes over the investigation. He's worked on hundreds of homicides, but this case will prove to be his most haunting.
The position of her body on the floor with her legs open made it apparent to me that there was at least sex, if not rape, involved in this crime. Rape is unfortunately a common crime. Rape and murder are not that common. Any kind of rape is never sexual gratification. It's a punishment of women. That's what it's about. But here we have someone who carries that punishment to the point of death, and that is unusual.
Forensic teams collect evidence both on the body and in the apartment.
They took samples of the blood spatters on the carpet. They also vacuumed the apartment for any hairs or trace evidence that may have fallen from a suspect during the course of the attack. Her wallet was there was cash there. The only purpose of this person being in this place was to rape and kill. There's no burglary, there's no theft, there's no removal of property. It's rape, kill, and leave.
The evidence suggests someone entered Mickey's apartment in the early morning hours, possibly through an open window. The suspect then surprised Mickey while she was asleep in bed. Bruising about Mickey's face suggested a quick and brutal attack.
It was the kind of thing where you're just thinking, wow, is this something that was random? Was it somebody that knew her? What happened that would cause her to be strangled and just left there?
Nothing about that crime scene said to me that our man spent any amount of time in there at all. It was very quick. There is no candle lighting, no ritualistic behavior, no moving of furniture, no prolonged physical assault. None of the things you often see in sexual assault. That's unusual. The next question is obvious. Why? Why is he doing that? Why is it important to him to get in and get out? Is it because people know him? Is it because there are so many people living here, somebody might see him? It could be any one of those things. He wants in, he wants out. We just don't know why.
Investigators question the witnesses who found the body. Lisa Spencer and her husband Tracy.
Lisa says that she saw Mickey Fillmore, the victim, the night before her body was discovered, and that she was happy and upbeat and having some pizza. She seemed to be her completely normal self. Neither Tracy nor Lisa said that they saw or heard anything in relation to Mickey's apartment or Mickey herself that was unusual or out of the ordinary.
But Lisa says that Mickey had been having troubles recently. Her fiance had left her and stopped paying the utility bills. And there's something else.
Lisa Spencer also told us that Mickey was concerned that she was pregnant. Everybody, the neighbors, including the Spencers, sort of kept an eye on her because she was such a nice person. Upbeat person, didn't drink, didn't use drugs, didn't cause trouble. We have nothing that says that Mickey lives a lifestyle that would put her at some level of risk.
To Kenda, however, they've just scratched the surface.
We find out she's pregnant. Is it her fiance's baby or is it someone else's? We don't know. Everybody seems to like Mickey, but nobody knows how she spends her time.
Police canvass the apartment building for more leads and find someone who does know how she spends her time.
One of the apartments adjacent to the victim's apartment, Mickey Fillmore's apartment, there were two brothers, Dexter and Dwight McNeil. Dexter actually lived at the apartment, and Dwight had come in from out of town, apparently to help Dexter move out. In talking with them, we were able to determine that Dwight actually went with the victim to a nightclub the evening prior, the night of July 18th.
Dwight McNeil says that when they were at a place called the Korean Club, another man came over to their table and talked with Mickey. It was apparent to Dwight that Mickey knew this person.
Dwight describes this individual as being 5'10" or 5'11", 170, 180 pounds, in his 20s. He has an earring in one ear and he has a New York-type accent. He sees them talking, doesn't pay a lot of attention to it. He's not there as a boyfriend to Mickey, he's just with her.
Dwight says that he and Mickey decided to leave the club at about 2 a.m. As they were walking out, he saw Mickey handing the same black male a small piece of paper.
He assumes it's a phone number or an address, he doesn't know.
Dwight says that the two returned to Mickey's apartment, where they stayed up talking until about 3:30 a.m. Then Dwight returned to his own unit.
When Dwight is at his apartment, it's now about 4 o'clock in the morning. He hears somebody knocking on Mickey's door. He has a front window in his apartment as well, just like Mickey does. So he pulls back the curtain and he sees the same black male that he saw at the club knocking on her door. And he's certain that this individual is the same person he saw in contact with Mickey at the club.
Dwight's timeline is supported by another witness living upstairs from Mickey.
She remembers being awakened by a scream. A woman's scream, very early that morning. She thought it was about 3:45 in the morning. Heard a scream, heard some thumping, like maybe a fight, maybe. But went back to sleep immediately and didn't hear anything else. Did Mickey arrange a late-night rendezvous that ended in murder? Maybe. Of course, the second possibility also exists. What if Mickey's fiancée wanted to end their relationship permanently?
In July 1986, Colorado Springs police find Mickey Fillmore strangled to death in her apartment. News of Mickey's murder stuns the local community and causes many to begin locking their doors.
When something like that happens in your apartment complex where you live, you are going to be concerned and everything, but I don't know that there was a heightened sense of, wow, I might be next. I might be, somebody who would be attacked by, a random serial killer.
Homicide detective Lt.Joe Kenda has several potential suspects, but little evidence. However, an autopsy paints a better picture of what happened to Mickey the night of her murder.
The injuries that you see kind of tell you the story of everything that happened to them. It's a story of the last few minutes or hours of her life. And the fact that those last few moments are filled with such violence and anger and rage, it does get to you. You push through because you know that it's important what you're doing so that there is justice for her.
Vaginal swabs indicate Mickey had sexual relations within 12 hours of her death. But contrary to what her neighbor told police, tests show Mickey was not pregnant, nor was she intoxicated.
Postmortem toxicology failed to reveal any evidence of drugs or alcohol.
When we first heard about the murder of Mickey Fillmore, we felt bad that here's a young woman that obviously had no real connection with any sort of crime scene or drugs, prostitution, things like that. I mean, there was really no reason that she would be a victim of a murder.
22-year-old Mickey Fillmore grew up in a small rural community in North Carolina. She joined the Army out of high school and traveled the world. Her 3-year tour of duty ended in December.
It's the parents' nightmare. It's the young girl in her early 20s. She's looking forward to meeting up with her fiancé. She's just living here for possibly just a few more weeks. I'm a parent now, and it's the type of thing that you just dread.
2 days after the murder, investigators finally reach Mickey's fiancé by telephone in Philadelphia. He sounds both surprised and shocked at the news. He said that he hadn't abandoned Mickey at all. He went back east to finalize a divorce from his first wife to marry Mickey. He has a solid alibi. He was 1,700 miles away at the time of the murder.
The fiancé looked good, but he could verify his whereabouts. Then he tells us he has a friend in Colorado Springs named Frank Lynch. He has requested that Frank Lynch keep an eye on Mickey until he can resolve his family situation. But he's also suspicious of Frank Lynch, that somehow maybe he's involved with Mickey. So what Mr. Davis provides us is another suspect, Mr. Lynch.
Lynch is brought to the station, but categorically denies any involvement in the murder.
Lynch admits that he is helping out Davis keep an eye on Mickey. He says he's not attracted to Mickey. He's not involved with Mickey. He has checked on her a couple of times. She has his phone number if she needs anything. He's not constantly at her apartment, has only been there once. He can account for himself on the night of the murder. There's no reason to believe there's any involvement between Mr. Lynch and Mickey beyond Mr. Davis's suspicions. So with that information in hand, we pretty much close out Mr. Lynch as part of the case.
Mickey's fiancé and Mr. Lynch are officially ruled out as suspects. But for police, it's not long before another falls in Lieutenant Kenda's lap.
A guy calls in and announces his name is DeCarlo Dowden. And he says, I am the guy that was with Mickey at the Korean Club the night before her death. Wow. Our guy that I'm interested in identifying has just identified himself.
After the murder of Mickey Fillmore, clues point to a mysterious man seen lurking outside her apartment at 4 in the morning. Detectives aren't sure of his identity, but a surprise call changes all of that.
Out of the blue, this guy calls us. Says his name is DeCarlo Dowden, and he wants to talk.
DeCarlo Dowden told us that he had driven to the club and ran into Mickey Fillmore. And while he didn't know her from before personally, he recognized her from the apartment complex. And as he walked by the table, he indicates that Mickey had kind of tugged at his pants and said hi to him, and so he stayed and engaged in conversation with them for a while.
When they're dancing, Mickey explains to him that she's not with this guy. He's just an escort that brought her to the club. Mr. Dowden says that in his opinion, she was indicating to him that she wanted to see more of him. As the evening wears on, she gives him a phone number. Said, this is my number. And he said, well, where do you live? Mr. Dowden believed that her manner and the way she was talking to him and so on, it was clear to him that she was offering him an invitation to come over. He asked her address and she provided it. In Mr. Dowden's mind, that was an open invitation. So we asked him, did you go over to her apartment? Yes, I did. Dowden says he knocked on her door, but there was no answer. And he says he left. He remembers that the curtain moved on the window that the McNeil brothers live in. He saw somebody look out, didn't see who it was, but he remembered that. And that's exactly what Dwight told us, that he looked out the window and saw it was this guy. Dowden insists that there's no answer at the door. He did not try the doorknob. He did not go in the apartment. He went and got in his car, left, and went home.
Dowden is freely providing this information to police, but Kenda is skeptical.
Here we have DeCarlo. Well, I was with that girl all night, and then, well, she gave me her address, and, well, I went over there. But I knocked on the door and I didn't go inside. You knocked on the door, you didn't try to go inside. You knocked on the door and you didn't see if the door was locked. What's up with that, DeCarlo? Is it possible he's telling the truth? Of course. Is it possible he's lying? Of course. I need something more than an opinion. I need physical evidence. Some of my men wanted to arrest him right then and there. Not going to happen. We don't have probable cause. We don't have enough. So before Mr. Dowden leaves, I ask him for biological samples, blood, hair, for comparison to my crime scene evidence that I'm still waiting for to be examined by the lab. He agrees. Said, fine, no problem. I didn't do this. I was not in her apartment. You can have any kind of sample you want. That's pretty positive for him. He's willing to give those up. Does it mean he didn't do it? No.
Investigators run a check on Dowden's hair and blood against that collected at the crime scene. That will take several weeks to process. In the meantime, they bring in Dwight McNeil, the victim's friend, who picks Dowden out of a photo lineup.
We did some more investigation. We found out that DeCarlo Dowden had some kind of prior meetings with Mickey from a club they were involved in, and that he had possibly been to her house.
DeCarlo does not impress me as a particularly intelligent guy, but this isn't about intelligence. Very few criminals are intelligent, but they are cunning. Is DeCarlo Dowden so clever that he is aware we will identify him as a suspect, and he understands the first to talk is the first to be believed? Or is he just a guy that wants to clear his name in a murder case?
Before police can answer that, a shocking development takes the case in an entirely new direction. On August 12th, 3 weeks after the murder of Mickey Fillmore, police make a discovery that stuns Lieutenant Kenda. Another body has been discovered in the same building.
This was not a coincidence. There was something going on in that apartment complex.
Immediately, I was frightened. I thought, oh no. Is it DeCarlo knocking on this door at 4 o'clock in the morning as well? Or are we just not even close?
Three weeks after Mickey Fillmore is found dead, police are circling DeCarlo Dowden as their primary suspect. But then, on August 12th, a neighbor of hers, 24-year-old Barbara Kramer, fails to show up for work.
Barbara Kramer is a registered nurse. She works at Eisenhower Hospital. She is a dedicated employee and hasn't missed a day of work since she started working at Eisenhower Hospital. On that day, she doesn't come to work. Her boss is instantly very distressed.
The hospital had called me and said that Barb didn't come to work and she hadn't called in. And that was so out of character for her. So that was kind of a panic button for me, that something had happened, and to go over there. And so we parked and started walking up to the apartment. And as we're coming closer to it, I could see her newspaper was laying outside her door. So you knew she hadn't been outside the house. The door was unlocked, and just instantly knew then something was wrong. I can remember it was really warm that day, and I was just cold. Just instantly, I was freezing cold. You could tell there had been a struggle right inside the door. There was a plant that was knocked over. There were things that were strewn around the room. That's when the friend who was with me come out and told me that she thought Barb was lying in her bedroom beside her bed on the floor.
The news comes as a shock. After the murder of her neighbor, Mickey Fillmore, Barbara's family had worried for her safety.
We had talked and made sure that she was keeping her door locked and, watching out for things and just being extra cautious,
But she said she'd be fine, and so it was, be careful, and she was a pretty careful person, and I kind of felt that she would be all right.
When Lieutenant Kenda arrives at the crime scene, he is horrified by what he finds.
I got almost sick to the stomach, not from looking at the body, but from knowing this is the same guy. This is Mickey, too. Barbara Kramer is a white female, 24 years old, tall, very pretty. Mickey Fillmore was a black female, somewhat shorter, but other than that distinction, it looked like the same crime scene. We have the bed sheets pulled off the bed from the right lower corner. She's on her back, displayed. She's been strangled. It's the same guy, and it's the same place. Coroner puts the time of death between 4 and 7 a.m. Discovery is shortly after 9 a.m. by her sister. So it's within a very brief period of time before that, consistent with the other time of day in the Mickey case.
Both victims have the same characteristics. Single female living alone. Attack occurs in the middle of the night, and both strangled.
I feel a very personal sense of sadness for what happened to this person. And in this case, it was the second homicide in the same apartment complex within a fairly short period of time. And we were concerned primarily for her, finding who did this and finding who did it so there wouldn't be a third one.
At the time, I really felt responsible for her. And obviously, I felt like I'd let her down, let my family down, because of what happened here.
This doesn't happen to us. You don't believe it. For a long time, you just kind of wished it would be a nightmare, that you'd wake up. But it was real.
Oh, as soon as I heard that this was the second one in a matter of weeks, I became suspicious that perhaps the killer or killers maybe lived in the area. Certainly, they could be watching, monitoring what steps were taken in our investigation.
Of all these hundreds of people we've talked to, surely we haven't talked to him, because he's carrying on here as if nothing matters. And that really frightened me.
The police were very concerned that there was a serial killer on the loose and that this wasn't going to end anytime soon.
Investigators immediately tracked down DeCarlo Dowden. He says he's been with his girlfriend all night.
And she alibis him out for Barbara Kramer. He's with her. He's still there now. Well, if DeCarlo Dowden didn't kill this woman, then he didn't kill Mickey either. My best suspect just went away. This is too similar of an offense. It cannot be one and not this one. Same killer, two targets. DeCarlo Dowden's not the guy. Who is? You're standing there thinking that your cunning guy is one step ahead of you for certain. How many more steps is it going to take? How many more people have to die before we figure out who this guy is? If he will do a second one, he's going to not stop until we stop him. How many more bodies are we going to have to get to before I find him?
Both victims were found in the same complex, and Detective Kenda thinks the killer may have stalked both victims before the attacks.
All the doors and all the windows and all the hallways look identical. How did he select the correct apartment? Because he knew what the correct apartment was. It's not random. He surveilled this person, at least for a period of time, to make certain he's in the right place and he's at the right time. He's smart enough to take some steps. Is he smart enough to take them all? Probably not. Probably not. How many mistakes did he make? 5, 10, 15, 20? How many mistakes? I have to find the mistakes.
Investigators canvass the apartment building for witnesses. Many are familiar faces from the Fillmore investigation.
We encountered the neighbor lady who says that she's awakened at 6:30 in the morning by a lady's scream and sounds of a fight. Thumping on the floor, thumping on the wall. She wasn't sure about that, but definite sounds of a fight and a lady's scream at 6:30. So I'm standing at the railing in this complex wondering if I should jump or not during the course of this case. One of my detectives comes up and says, "Hey, I think we got something good." What do we got?
What police have is more information. Information that may prove critical.
The neighbor lady explains that she's coming out of her door at 6:25 in the morning. I live right close to Barbara Kramer. Live right there. I look over at her door, and Tracy Spencer is knocking on her door. He's got a piece of paper in his hand. I see him. I know him. I've talked to him many times. The door opens, and Spencer goes inside. And then the door slams shut. I mean, slams really hard. And I thought that was kind of strange. Oh, baby, so do I. So do I.
Tracy Spencer was a key witness in the Mickey Fillmore investigation. He was the one that found her body and originally called police.
It just smacks me in the head. Tracy Spencer is there when Mickey Fillmore is dead. And now Tracy's going into Barbara Kramer's apartment when she's discovered dead. Oh my, I have a new guy, and that is Tracy Spencer.
After two women are murdered in the same apartment complex, neighbors fear that a serial killer is living nearby.
You think, wow, is this something that is just random, that they happen to live in the same apartment complex? Or is there somebody that is stalking women, single women, young women who live in an apartment complex and they're finding them vulnerable and they're breaking in?
We knew not only would it be very unnerving for that community within the apartment complex, but it's unnerving to us as well to know that there's somebody out there that has now killed two people and you're not sure who it is.
But when a witness names Tracy Spencer as a possible suspect in the Barbara Kramer case, investigators realize he was the same person who admitted finding Mickey Fillmore's body. Police refocus on Tracy and his background.
He had a minor criminal history. No history of sexual assault. Minor criminal activity, not unlike anybody else in the building. Nothing about it stood out.
All of a sudden, the police had the situation where the person who called in the first murder, who discovered it, who discovered the body, was now the prime suspect in both murders. This was certainly something that wasn't ordinary or expected.
I'm not a big believer in coincidences. Tracy Spencer has just found himself as suspect number 1 in 2 murder investigations. I have put surveillance on Tracy Spencer's apartment. I'm applying for an arrest warrant to arrest him for 2 counts of first-degree murder. But we need to re-interview everyone. We need to start over. Again.
Kenda doesn't want to talk to him just yet. The veteran detective first wants to speak with his wife, Lisa. Lisa and Tracy found Mickey's body together.
We tell her what's going on, that we intend to arrest her husband. She initially denies everything. She sticks to her initial story. My husband just found Mickey. He was with me all night. Same stories that she told at the time that Mickey was discovered. When I tell her that we have an eyewitness that knows Tracy, that sees him go into Barbara Kramer's apartment with a piece of paper in his hand and slam the door behind him, then she starts to cry.
It's not uncommon for a wife to give a defendant an alibi until she realizes who she's dealing with and the type of person she's dealing with. And then oftentimes they will come forward and tell the truth.
Then I said, Lisa, if you continue to protect him, I'm going to figure out a way to throw you in jail too. She then breaks down completely and says, well, I lied. You lied about what? I lied that Tracy was with me all night, the night that Mickey was found, because he wasn't. He goes out and goes for walks. He leaves the apartment. He goes away. What else? Well, he was talking to me about Barbara Kramer. He said that he's been finding her mail laying on the sidewalk, that maybe the wind blew it out of the mailboxes, and that he should go give it back to her. Do you ever find mail around here, Lisa? No. Aren't they locked mailboxes? Well, yeah, they are. Didn't you think that was odd, that he would find mail from Barbara Kramer and no one else? Well, I wondered about it, but I didn't know.
Lisa says that Tracy had an envelope for Barbara Kramer, but she'd accidentally thrown it away. and Tracy became very angry.
He was looking for that envelope that had her name on it, but I had thrown it away. I didn't tell him that, but he was like really agitated. I got to find that. I have to take that to her. I have to give her that. She didn't tell him where it was, but it was in the trash.
Lisa also admits that she lied to police when she said she found Mickey Fillmore's body.
She did not go in through the window. She did not find the body. That she was just doing all that to help him out.
Why would you defend someone who has murdered a woman? Because your response is you love him? That's what Lisa said. But I love Tracy. Really? Well, maybe he's going to love you back, and maybe he's going to love you to death.
While Kenda is interviewing Lisa, detectives at the complex report that Tracy Spencer is leaving his apartment at that very moment.
One of my detectives calls and says, Tracy Spencer's out of his apartment and he's walking toward his car. Forget the warrant. Arrest him now. Yes, sir. They lock Tracy up and bring him to me.
Tracy is brought to the station while police build their case.
We then apply for a search warrant for the apartment based on the statements that we got from Lisa. We get a warrant. In Tracy Spencer's apartment, inside the trash, we find an envelope that has the name Barbara Kramer written there. The envelope is empty, but it does have her name written there.
Hours after the murder of Barbara Kramer, Tracy Spencer sits in the interrogation room.
Tracy is a prolific liar. Tracy has lied to everybody all the time about everything. So he sticks to his story. We tell him, Tracy, we have people that know you and see you go into her apartment. He says, okay, I did that. You did? Yes. I had mail that I found on the sidewalk that belonged to Barbara Kramer, and I was going to deliver it to her. Okay, what happened? She opened the door, I gave her her envelope, she took it, she thanked me, she closed the door, and I left. So you just had this brief contact with Barbara Kramer, right? So all of that, what you told me is the truth? Oh, yes. So we have witnesses see you go inside the apartment, you didn't go inside? No, I didn't do that. He absolutely denies everything because that's what he does.
Detectives change gears and confront Spencer about the murder of Mickey Fillmore.
We told Tracy Spencer we had found his semen and his pubic hair in Mickey Fillmore. That wasn't true. We didn't have results yet. But I told him that. He has an immediate reaction. Well, you see, I lied. I lied when I talked about Mickey because I didn't want my wife to know that she and I were having an affair. And I had sex with her that night, consensual sex. I went to her apartment, she and I had sex, I wished her goodbye, and when I left, she was fine. In Tracy's mind, he has an explanation for everything, even for physical evidence found from the scene of a rape. No matter what you say, he's got an answer that could be, might be true. And since Mickey's no longer alive to tell us that, maybe they'll believe me. How much nerve do you have to carry out sexual assault murders when there's a policeman around every doorway? I'm going to commit this crime anyway. I have surveilled this woman, and I'm going to rape and kill her. And if I get caught, I'll lie my way out of it, just like I did with Mickey.
But he can't lie his way out of the lab results. The blood found at the scene of Mickey Fillmore's murder comes back as a match to Tracy Spencer. Hair samples also match those collected from Barbara Kramer's apartment. Spencer is placed under arrest for the murders of both Mickey Fillmore and Barbara Kramer.
Due to the fact that we had two good eyewitness accounts of what had occurred that morning, we felt it was enough to have him booked on that charge of first-degree murder.
On December 31st, 1986, Tracy Spencer pleads guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. He is later sentenced to life in prison plus 24 years and will be eligible for parole in 2032.
2 young women had come to Colorado Springs from their hometowns, long ways away. Their families sent them to what certainly isn't a big city, but to them was going to the big city.
He didn't know these girls. He just picked them out because he had seen them and figured out a way to get into their apartment. And then once inside, he just overpowered them and ended up raping and killing them.
Their lives were taken from them by a man who just wanted to have a little pleasure. Their lives were snuffed out. Their families were robbed of their daughters for no real reason.
One of the things that bother me most is how could Lisa Spencer initially back her husband's story that he just happened to randomly find this body when she knew for a fact that he was in that apartment with the victim at the time of the murder. She's as much guilty, in my opinion, as her husband for participating in the cover-up of these killings.
What makes this case stick out for me, this one scared me the most. I was literally frightened. Here I am in the middle of this, not knowing who I'm chasing, but knowing if I don't find him, this is going to be beyond horrible. It already is. It already is. But it's going to get infinitely worse. I'm there to prevent that sort of thing from happening. Didn't do it. 2 women paid the price for this. There could have been more. There wasn't, but there.
At 6:42 a.m., the phone rang in a quiet Ohio house where nothing ever happened fast, and the sound split the morning like a gunshot, sharp, out of place, the kind of ring that makes you sit upright before you even know why, the kind that carries weight before a single word is spoken, because in towns like this, calls before sunrise don't bring good news, they bring police. They bring silence. They bring a name spoken too carefully. Outside, frost still clung to the edges of mailboxes and the sky was a flat, exhausted gray, the color of a story that would never quite lift, and inside, a life was about to divide cleanly into before and after, into the last normal moment and everything that followed. By noon, the street was crawling with cruisers, neighbors standing in bathrobes, coffee going cold in their hands, watching uniformed figures move in and out with clipped urgency, and by evening, the local station broke into regular programming with a banner that would become painfully familiar. Ohio woman missing, last seen the night before, circumstances unclear, police requesting information. Her name was spoken once, twice, then repeated until it began to lose its softness, until it hardened into something official, something public, something no longer fully hers. She was 27, lived alone, worked a steady job, no known enemies, no reason to disappear, which in police language meant the worst possibilities were already on the table. The apartment was too clean, almost staged, the kind of neatness that feels wrong when someone is gone. No signs of a struggle, no broken glass, no overturned furniture. Her purse sat by the door. Her car was still in the lot. Keys on the counter. Shoes lined up neatly like she planned to come back. Detectives noted it all with practiced detachment, but even they felt the unease settle in, that subtle wrongness that doesn't show up in reports, the sense that whatever happened didn't explode into the room, it slipped through quietly, deliberately, leaving almost nothing behind. Neighbors reported nothing. No screams. No arguments. One man thought he heard a car door late at night, but couldn't say for sure. Another mentioned footsteps on the stairs, maybe, or maybe just memory filling in blanks after the fact. A security camera at a nearby gas station captured a grainy figure crossing the lot hours later, too dark, too distant to identify, a smudge of movement that would be replayed thousands of times, slowed down, zoomed in, analyzed frame by frame until the pixels themselves seemed exhausted, still refusing to give up a face. Within days, the case hardened into a familiar shape. Flyers taped to poles. Candlelight vigils where people stood shoulder to shoulder, whispering prayers, promising not to forget. The word cold case hadn't been spoken yet, but it hovered there, uninvited, waiting. Investigators canvassed, questioned co-workers, ex-boyfriends, neighbors, anyone whose name brushed against hers, but nothing stuck. Alibis held. Leads evaporated. Tips poured in and dried up just as fast. Every path led to another dead end, another locked door, another shrug of uncertainty. Weeks turned into months, and the community began to change in small, telling ways. Doors locked earlier. Porch lights stayed on all night. Parents walked their children to school even in daylight. Conversations lowered when strangers passed by. The fear wasn't loud, it was constant, a low hum beneath daily life, the awareness that someone had vanished without explanation, and that the space where answers should be was still empty. Detectives revisited the apartment again and again, hoping repetition might shake something loose. They found nothing new, only the same stillness, the same unanswered questions. Forensic tests came back inconclusive. No DNA worth naming. No fingerprints that didn't belong. The scene offered no confession, no hint of violence, just absence, and absence is the hardest thing to prove. Then came the call that jolted the case back to life. A tip phoned in late one night. A voice claiming to have seen her with a man near the highway, arguing, tense, just hours before she disappeared. Officers followed it eagerly, desperate for momentum, but surveillance footage didn't support it. Witnesses contradicted each other, and the story collapsed under scrutiny, leaving investigators with nothing but the familiar weight of disappointment. As the first anniversary approached, the media returned with renewed interest, recycling footage, replaying interviews, asking the same questions in slightly different tones. What happened that night? Who took her? Why hasn't anyone talked? The questions echoed through living rooms and kitchens, unanswered, unanswered, unanswered. Her family sat through it all, faces etched with exhaustion, hope worn thin, but still stubbornly alive, clinging to the belief that somewhere, somehow, the truth was waiting. Years passed. Detectives retired. New ones took their place, flipping through old files, learning her name like it was history, not an open wound. Evidence boxes gathered dust. Leads went cold. The case slipped from front-page news to the back of a filing cabinet, still technically open, still unresolved, but no longer urgent in a system always chasing the next emergency. And yet, the town never quite let it go. Her name lingered in conversations, in warnings whispered to newcomers, in the way people glanced over their shoulders in parking lots after dark. It became a reference point, a shared trauma, a reminder that certainty is fragile, and safety can vanish without warning. Some nights, investigators would revisit the timeline, staring at the same hours, the same gaps, wondering what they missed. Was it someone she knew, someone trusted, someone who walked through that door without resistance? Or a stranger, a chance encounter that turned fatal? The evidence refused to choose, and the silence around the case felt intentional, as if the truth itself was hiding. By the time the decade mark arrived, the phrase Ohio 2000 cold case had become shorthand, a headline without a resolution, a story people recognized even if they couldn't recall every detail. It was a case study in disappearance, in investigative frustration, in how a life can simply slip off the map and leave behind only questions. And still, somewhere in the town, in a house or an apartment, or a passing memory, the night she vanished remained intact, preserved, waiting, a sequence of moments known fully to someone who had never spoken, someone who moved on while the rest of the community stayed frozen in that early morning phone call, that first jolt of fear, that instant when everything changed and never changed back. The second year began the way the first had ended, quietly, without ceremony, the case still open on paper, but already drifting toward that dangerous space where urgency fades and familiarity takes over, where a disappearance becomes a file instead of a face. Detectives rotated in and out, each bringing fresh eyes, each convinced the answer was hiding somewhere obvious, overlooked, misread, but the deeper they dug, the more the ground seemed to give way beneath them. The timeline was rebuilt again from scratch, minute by minute, phone records spread across tables, receipts logged, bus schedules checked, weather reports pulled, because sometimes the smallest variable can crack everything open. Sometimes rain delays a witness. Sometimes a power outage erases a camera. Sometimes a call placed and never answered becomes the loudest sound in the room. Her last confirmed contact was unremarkable, a brief conversation with a co-worker about the next day's shift, casual, routine, no hint of fear or distress. The call ended normally. No follow-up. No voicemail left behind. After that, silence. Investigators stared at that gap like it was a wound, probing it from every angle, wondering what could happen in the space between a normal goodbye and a vanished person. They traced her movements backward through the day, the grocery store where a cashier remembered her smile, the bank where a teller recalled nothing unusual, the gas station receipt time-stamped early evening, the last solid marker before the night swallowed her whole. Attention shifted to her circle, small but defined. Friends described her as cautious, predictable, someone who didn't take risks without reason. She wasn't known for spontaneous trips or late-night disappearances. She checked in. She showed up. Which made the lack of explanation feel heavier, more deliberate. Investigators asked the same questions over and over, sometimes weeks apart, watching for cracks, inconsistencies, the tiniest shift in body language. Most people stayed steady. A few grew defensive. One former acquaintance stumbled over timelines, mixed up dates, corrected himself too quickly, but nothing rose to the level of probable cause. Suspicion flickered, then dimmed again. The apartment complex became a focal point. Detectives knocked on every door, twice, sometimes 3 times, hoping repetition would jog a memory, that someone would suddenly recall a face, a sound, a car idling too long in the lot. Most residents offered the same answer, nothing unusual. But nothing unusual felt less comforting with each retelling. It suggested either perfect silence or perfect concealment. Maintenance records were pulled. Work orders reviewed. A contractor had been on site that week, cleared after an interview and an alibi. A neighbor with a criminal record was questioned extensively, but phone data placed him miles away. Every theory built momentum, then collapsed under scrutiny. Evidence processing dragged on, constrained by the technology of the time. Hair samples without roots. Fibers that could have come from anywhere. Partial prints that matched no one. Each result landed like a muted thud, not a failure exactly, but not progress either. The case remained suspended in that uncomfortable middle, too serious to abandon, too thin to advance. Rumors filled the vacuum. Some whispered she'd left voluntarily, started over somewhere new, but her bank account told a different story. No activity. No withdrawals. No digital footprint. Others insisted it was a crime of passion, that someone snapped, acted once, then disappeared back into normal life. That idea stuck, because it explained the quiet, the lack of witnesses, the absence of chaos. It also meant the person responsible might still be walking the same streets, shopping at the same stores, nodding politely to neighbors who had no idea. Investigators pursued a lead involving a vehicle spotted near the complex around midnight, described inconsistently as dark, maybe blue, maybe black, an older model with a damaged tail light. Dozens of similar cars were identified and tracked down. Owners questioned. Repair shops canvassed. Nothing definitive emerged. The car became another ghost, another outline without substance, haunting the edges of the investigation. As pressure mounted, law enforcement expanded the search radius. Fields, wooded areas, abandoned buildings, riverbanks. Volunteers joined in, combing through brush, eyes scanning for anything out of place. Each discovery raised hope, then crushed it. A discarded jacket that wasn't hers. Bones that turned out to be animal. The land yielded nothing but exhaustion and the growing sense that whatever happened didn't leave its remains where anyone was looking. Her family grew more vocal, pushing for attention, for resources, for answers. They held press conferences, their grief sharp and public, demanding to know how a young woman could disappear without a trace in a town where everyone supposedly knew everyone. Officials reassured them the case was active, ongoing, not forgotten, words that sounded increasingly hollow as months stretched into years. Inside the department, the case became a reference point, brought up in meetings as an example of how difficult missing person investigations can be when there's no crime scene, no suspect, no direction. Some detectives believed the answer lay in her personal life, something she'd hidden well. Others were convinced it was random, a stranger passing through, someone with no ties to the area, making the trail impossible to follow. The debate went unresolved, splitting attention, diluting focus. Technology advanced, slowly at first. Databases improved. DNA analysis sharpened. Evidence was retested, then tested again years later, each time with the same result, insufficient. The hope that science would rescue the investigation lingered, fragile but persistent, a promise deferred but never fully abandoned. The community adapted to the uncertainty, but it never truly healed. Her disappearance became a marker in time, a story parents told teenagers, a cautionary tale folded into everyday life. New residents learned about it through hushed conversations and outdated news clippings. Old residents measured time by it, before she vanished, after she vanished, as if the town itself had been altered on a fundamental level. Detectives aged. Some carried the case with them into retirement, files under their arms, still convinced the breakthrough was just one interview away, one overlooked connection waiting to be made. They replayed conversations in their heads, wondering if a pause had been too short, a follow-up question never asked, a detail dismissed too quickly. By the end of the second year, the case had settled into a grim rhythm. Periodic reviews. Occasional tips. Media check-ins on anniversaries. Each cycle raised expectations, then let them fall again. The phrase "no new developments" became a refrain, a barrier between hope and reality. And somewhere, beneath all the paperwork and speculation, the truth remained intact, unchanged by time, untouched by investigation, sitting in the mind of someone who knew exactly what happened after that last ordinary phone call, someone who had watched the search unfold, the questions multiply, the years pass, and still said nothing, letting silence do the work, letting the mystery deepen, letting an entire community orbit an absence that refused to explain itself. By the third year, the case no longer felt like an emergency, it felt like a presence, something that lingered in the background of every decision, every patrol route, every quiet night shift, a reminder that not all crimes announce themselves with sirens and blood. Some simply erase a person and dare you to explain how. The file grew thicker, heavier, swollen with reports that led nowhere, tips that contradicted each other, theories layered on top of theories until the original facts were almost buried beneath speculation. New detectives read through it slowly, carefully, as if the truth might leap out if handled gently enough. One investigator fixated on the timing, that narrow window between her last confirmed sighting and the early morning call that set everything in motion. He believed the key was there, hidden in routine, masked by normalcy. People underestimate routine, he'd say, because it looks harmless. He re-interviewed witnesses who had already been questioned twice, sometimes 3 times, asking the same questions in different orders, listening not just to what they said, but how they said it, watching for hesitation, for irritation, for the subtle signs of someone tired of pretending. Most interviews ended the same way they always had, with polite cooperation and no revelations. Another detective focused on geography. He mapped the area repeatedly, drawing circles, tracing likely routes, marking places where a car could stop unnoticed, where a person could be forced inside without attracting attention. He drove those routes at different times of night, windows down, engine idling, trying to feel the darkness the way it must have felt then. Some streets were brighter than memory suggested. Others were almost aggressively dark. The town had blind spots, he realized, pockets of shadow where anything could happen and no one would see. The gas station footage was revisited again, enhanced with newer software, the grain smoothed, the contrast adjusted, the mystery figure isolated. It was still just a shape, still too vague to identify, but something about the gate caught attention. A slight limp, maybe. Or maybe just the distortion of low-quality video. Analysts argued quietly, professionally, about whether it meant anything at all. The image was printed, pinned to a board, stared at until it felt accusatory, as if it knew more than it was willing to share. Rumors intensified as official progress stalled. Someone claimed she'd been seen in another state, working under a different name. Someone else insisted she'd been taken by a serial offender passing through. A third theory suggested a domestic connection, a secret relationship gone wrong. Each rumor sparked a brief flare of hope, then died under scrutiny, leaving behind only the familiar ache of disappointment. The case attracted amateur sleuths, armchair detectives dissecting details online, pointing fingers, inventing villains, sometimes naming innocent people with reckless confidence. Law enforcement tried to rein in the noise, but silence created its own problems. The less information released, the more the public filled in the gaps themselves. The case became a mirror, reflecting whatever fear or suspicion the community already carried. For some, it was about strangers. For others, it was about betrayal. Everyone had a version that made sense to them. Her family lived in a suspended state, grief without closure, hope without evidence. They kept her room intact, her belongings untouched, as if she might walk back in and need everything just as she left it. Holidays were the worst, the empty chair a silent accusation, the unanswered question hanging over every gathering. They learned to measure time not in years, but in what ifs. What if she'd stayed home that night? What if someone had noticed something sooner? What if the phone had rung 5 minutes earlier? Inside the department, resources shifted. New cases demanded attention, cases with bodies, with suspects, with something tangible to work against. This one remained stubbornly abstract. It resurfaced during audits, during training sessions, during conversations late at night when officers admitted which cases kept them awake. This was one of those. The kind that made you doubt the idea that effort always leads to answers. A break almost came from an unexpected place. A woman from a neighboring county reported a disturbing encounter years earlier, a man who had followed her, pressured her, made her feel trapped. The description bore a passing resemblance to someone loosely connected to the missing woman's social circle. Detectives moved quickly, energized by the possibility of a pattern, a repeat offender hiding in plain sight. The man was located, questioned, investigated thoroughly. His alibi held. The resemblance dissolved under closer examination. Another door slammed shut. As technology crept forward, so did expectations. The public began to believe every case could be solved eventually, that time favored justice, that answers were inevitable. Investigators knew better. Time helps only if something survives it. In this case, time had eaten away at memories, blurred details, allowed people to move, to die, to forget. Witnesses aged. Some passed away. Others simply couldn't remember with the clarity they once had. The past became unstable, unreliable. Cold case specialists reviewed the file with a different mindset, looking not for dramatic revelations, but for procedural mistakes, missed opportunities. They questioned why certain leads were prioritized over others, why some interviews weren't recorded, why a particular tip was dismissed early on. Nothing rose to the level of a smoking gun, but the review left a quiet, unsettling impression that the case might have slipped through cracks too small to see at the time. The phrase missing but not forgotten appeared in articles, in speeches, in memorial posts, but repetition dulled its meaning. Forgetting doesn't always look like erasure. Sometimes it looks like acceptance, like people learning to live around an unanswered question, instead of confronting it every day. The town did that. Life went on. New families moved in. New businesses opened. The world didn't stop for one missing woman, no matter how much it should have. And yet, certain places never shook the association. The apartment complex. The gas station. The stretch of road where the car had been reported. People slowed there unconsciously, glanced around, felt the hair on their arms rise for no clear reason. The story had seeped into the geography, turning ordinary locations into quiet memorials. Detectives continued to ask the question that had no satisfying answer: why no trace? No body. No belongings. No definitive evidence of a crime. It suggested planning, control, someone who understood how to leave nothing behind. Or it suggested sheer luck, a cascade of coincidences that allowed a violent act to vanish into the night. Neither explanation was comforting. By the end of the third year, the case had become a study in endurance. Endurance of the family, still waiting. Endurance of investigators, still checking boxes, still hoping for the call that would change everything. Endurance of a community living with the knowledge that certainty is a luxury, not a guarantee. And through it all, the silence held. The person who knew what happened remained invisible, protected by time, by caution, by the simple fact that no one had forced the truth out into the open. The mystery didn't fade. It deepened, settling into the collective consciousness, an unresolved chord that never quite resolved, promising that somewhere beneath the layers of years and doubt, the story was still there, complete, coherent, waiting for the moment when silence would finally fail. The fourth year arrived without announcement, without urgency, slipping into the case the same way the case had slipped into the town, quietly, persistently, changing the shape of things without ever drawing attention to itself. By now, the disappearance had hardened into legend, not myth, but something close to it, a story retold so often it began to feel inevitable, as if this town had always been heading toward a moment like that night, as if the absence had been waiting for its place in local history. Investigators felt the weight of that expectation every time they opened the file, every time they saw her photograph clipped to the inside cover, smiling, alive, frozen in a moment untouched by what came next. A renewed push came from the outside. State-level analysts requested the file, reviewing it with distance, without emotional attachment, without the fatigue that had settled into the local department. Fresh eyes, they said. That phrase carried hope and accusation at the same time. The analysts flagged patterns that had gone largely unquestioned, the emphasis on certain suspects over others, the reliance on witness memory months after the fact, the early assumption that there had been no struggle. They asked whether quiet always meant voluntary, whether order always meant safety, whether the absence of chaos could itself be a sign of control. Attention returned to the apartment, not as a crime scene, but as a psychological space. Someone had been there with her, they argued. Someone she didn't fear. Someone who didn't force their way in. The door hadn't been damaged. Neighbors hadn't heard raised voices. Whatever happened likely unfolded calmly at first, which narrowed the field and made it more terrifying. Calm requires trust, or at least familiarity. Calm means time. Detectives revisited people who had once been considered peripheral. A co-worker who'd offered to walk her to her car weeks earlier. A neighbor who'd helped carry groceries once. A man who'd shown up unannounced at a social gathering and left just as quietly. None of them fit neatly into the role of suspect, but none could be completely dismissed either. The interviews were polite, almost cordial, but beneath the surface, tension crackled. Everyone understood why the questions were being asked again. Everyone understood how many years had passed. Memory had become an unreliable witness. Phone records were re-examined, this time with more sophisticated analysis. Calls once dismissed as meaningless were scrutinized for pattern. A number that appeared briefly, then vanished. A short call late in the evening, too brief to convey much, but long enough to arrange something. Investigators wondered whether the key conversation wasn't emotional at all, whether it was transactional, practical, the kind that leaves no trace of distress, because none was felt yet. The gas station footage resurfaced yet again, now accompanied by debate over whether the figure was even relevant. Some argued it was a distraction, a coincidence elevated by desperation. Others insisted coincidences don't align so cleanly, that timing matters, that shadows matter. The limp was debated again, endlessly, until it became symbolic rather than factual, a flaw projected onto a blur, because investigators needed something human to latch onto. Public interest flared briefly after a true crime segment aired statewide. The phones lit up. Tips poured in. Some were earnest. Others were fueled by attention, by the desire to be part of the story. One caller claimed to know where the body was buried, gave directions that led to an empty field and nothing else. Another named a suspect who had died years earlier, conveniently unable to defend himself. Each tip had to be chased. Each dead end carved away another piece of optimism. Her family watched all of this with careful restraint. They'd learned not to react too strongly to developments, not to let hope outrun reality. Still, every call from investigators tightened something in their chests. Every mention of progress reignited the same fragile question: is this it? They lived in that question, permanently braced for answers that never came. Within the department, the case had become a measure of patience. Younger officers heard about it from veterans, learned the details like a cautionary tale. Do the work early, they were told. Don't assume. Don't rush to conclusions. This case was what happened when certainty arrived too soon and stayed too long. It was a reminder that the truth doesn't always announce itself clearly, and that mistakes made in the first days echo for decades. A theory began to circulate quietly, not officially endorsed, but discussed in low voices. What if the disappearance wasn't planned far in advance? What if it was improvised, a decision made in a narrow window, driven by opportunity rather than intent? That would explain the lack of preparation, the absence of a clear trail. It would also explain why nothing quite fit. Crimes of impulse don't leave clean narratives behind. They leave confusion. That idea reframed everything. The suspect pool widened again. Anyone who crossed her path that night became relevant, even briefly. A ride offered. A conversation extended. A door opened. Investigators tried to reconstruct the night not as a single event, but as a chain of ordinary moments that, taken together, could have turned fatal. It was unsettling how plausible that felt. As the fourth year closed, the case sat in an uneasy state. Not active in the traditional sense, but not dormant either. It existed in review sessions, in periodic task force meetings, in the back of detectives' minds during unrelated calls. It surfaced in moments of quiet, when nothing else demanded attention, when the unanswered questions had room to breathe. The town continued to live around the absence, but the edges were sharper now. People no longer asked when it would be solved. They asked if it ever would be. That shift mattered. It marked the moment hope stopped being loud and became private, something people carried silently rather than shared. And somewhere beyond the reach of interviews and evidence logs, the full story remained intact, unedited by time, unchanged by speculation. Every movement, every decision, every moment after she vanished existed in perfect clarity for someone who had never been forced to confront it. The years piled up. The questions multiplied. And still, the truth stayed hidden, patient, waiting for the one crack in the silence that would finally let it escape. By the 5th year, the word cold no longer felt metaphorical. It felt literal, like something preserved, locked in ice, the edges sharp, the center unreachable. The case file had weight now, not just in pages but in reputation. Officers spoke about it carefully, almost reverently, as if saying the wrong thing out loud might seal its fate forever. This was no longer just a missing person investigation. It was a warning. A lesson. Proof that disappearance didn't need chaos, didn't need witnesses, didn't need noise. The department authorized a focused cold case review, smaller, quieter, stripped of public expectation. A handful of detectives, a conference room, boxes opened again. They started at the beginning, deliberately slow, pretending they didn't know how it ended, pretending the outcome was still malleable. Every assumption was questioned. Every early conclusion relabeled as provisional. Why had the apartment been considered safe? Why had calm been equated with consent? Why had certain names drifted out of focus so quickly? One detail resurfaced that hadn't seemed important at the time. A neighbor had mentioned a brief knock late that night, soft, not urgent, easy to dismiss as nothing. The statement had been buried in supplemental notes, overshadowed by louder, more dramatic tips. Now it was circled in red. A knock meant someone outside. A knock meant a choice was made to open the door. A knock meant the night didn't begin with force. It began with permission. Detectives replayed that moment again and again in their minds. Who would she open the door for that late? Someone familiar. Someone expected. Or someone who knew how to sound harmless. They revisited her phone records around that time, aligning the knock with call logs, with text activity, with gaps where communication should have been but wasn't. The silence around that hour grew heavier the more they stared at it. Another overlooked detail followed. A co-worker had once mentioned she seemed distracted in the days before she vanished, not frightened, just preoccupied. At the time, it had been written off as stress, routine, nothing actionable. Now it felt different. Preoccupation suggested anticipation. Something unresolved. Something pending. Investigators wondered whether the key to the case wasn't in the night itself, but in the days leading up to it, in conversations no one else heard. They pulled personal records again, more carefully this time. Emails. Notes. Calendars. Everything mundane, everything incomplete. Nothing explicitly alarming surfaced, but patterns emerged. A cancelled plan. A rescheduled meeting. A window of time that had been cleared deliberately. It wasn't proof. It was shape. And shape mattered when nothing else did. The gas station footage was finally downgraded, no longer treated as a centerpiece, more like a background noise that had grown too loud. Letting go of it felt like failure to some, relief to others. With it gone, attention turned inward, back toward the apartment, back toward familiarity, back toward the uncomfortable idea that the danger hadn't come from outside the community at all. Publicly, nothing changed. No press conferences. No dramatic statements. Quiet work didn't generate headlines. But inside the task force, tension returned. For the first time in years, people argued again. Disagreed. Took sides. That alone felt like progress. Stagnation doesn't provoke emotion. Possibility does. Her family sensed the shift before they were told. Investigators asked more precise questions, questions that assumed intent rather than accident, questions that revisited personal boundaries, relationships, moments that once felt too small to matter. It was exhausting, painful, but also clarifying. For the first time in a long while, it felt like someone was digging in the right place, even if no one could say why. Outside the investigation, the town had learned to coexist with the case. It surfaced occasionally in conversation, usually late at night, usually after someone said, "Do you remember?" New generations knew the name without knowing the details. Old generations knew the details without knowing what to do with them. The absence had become part of the landscape, like an abandoned building everyone avoided but never tore down. One night, a detective stayed late, alone with the file, rereading the earliest interviews, listening to the tone beneath the words. He noticed something he hadn't before. Certain people spoke about her in the past tense immediately, even when hope was still officially alive. Others avoided tense altogether, dancing around language like it was dangerous. Language reveals more than facts when facts are scarce. It shows what people believe, even when they don't say it outright. Names were circled again. Not accused. Not elevated. Just marked. The list was shorter now, tighter, more uncomfortable. These weren't strangers. These were people who had gone on with their lives, aged, built routines, blended back into normalcy while the case froze in time. That contrast was unsettling. It suggested the crime, if there was one, had been survivable for the person who committed it. As the 5th anniversary passed, there were no candles, no speeches, no cameras. Just a quiet acknowledgement, internal, restrained. 5 years was long enough for hope to thin, long enough for memory to soften, long enough for someone to believe they were safe. That belief was dangerous. It made people careless. It made secrets heavy. And somewhere, behind ordinary days and unremarkable nights, the truth remained unchanged. The knock. The door opening. The moment everything tipped from normal into irreversible. 5 years hadn't altered that sequence at all. It had only widened the distance between those who were searching and the one who already knew, who had lived half a decade with the full story locked inside, waiting, whether knowingly or not, for the day the ice would finally crack. 6 years in, the case existed in 2 timelines at once. One frozen in 2000, rigid and unchanging, the night preserved like a photograph that refused to fade. The other moving forward relentlessly, dragging everyone else with it, aging faces, shifting priorities, thinning patience. The distance between those timelines grew wider every year, and investigators felt it acutely, the sense that they were reaching backward through time with hands that could no longer quite touch what they needed. The cold case unit worked differently now. No rush. No illusions. They weren't hunting confessions or dramatic revelations. They were looking for pressure points, places where the past rubbed uncomfortably against the present. People change, routines shift, guilt matures. What once felt manageable can become unbearable given enough time. That was the theory, anyway. That time, which had protected the truth for so long, might eventually betray it. They began tracking life trajectories. Who had moved suddenly after the disappearance? Who had changed jobs, left the state, severed ties? Who had stayed, stubbornly rooted, never leaving the orbit of the town? Stability could be as suspicious as flight. Both were reactions. Both told stories. Investigators compared notes, drawing lines between dates and decisions, searching for correlations that might have been invisible before. One name surfaced again, not loudly, not definitively, but persistently. Someone who had never been a prime suspect, never the focus of attention, but who appeared repeatedly at the edges of the narrative. Present but unremarkable. Helpful but forgettable. The kind of person investigators often overlook, because there's nothing obviously wrong. The kind of person who understands how to stay neutral. They revisited his interviews. The tone was calm. Cooperative. Too smooth, some thought. He had offered information freely, but always about others, never himself. His timeline aligned neatly with available data, but only because it was vague enough to slide past scrutiny. No precise times. No anchors. Just generalities. At the time, that hadn't mattered. Now it did. Detectives debated internally. Was this pattern meaningful, or were they projecting order onto randomness? Cold cases are vulnerable to that, the human need to impose narrative where none exists. Still, they pressed forward, quietly, carefully, unwilling to announce anything they couldn't support. They pulled financial records. Nothing dramatic. No sudden windfalls. No obvious distress. Just a life proceeding normally, year after year. Technology offered incremental advantages. Cell tower data that once seemed useless was reanalyzed, not for exact locations, but for exclusions. Where phones weren't. Where silence aligned too neatly with the disappearance. Patterns emerged, faint but persistent. The margins narrowed. Possibility condensed. The family noticed another shift. Investigators were no longer asking about the abstract. They were asking about moments. Specific conversations. Minor disagreements. Offers of help that might have carried hidden weight. It hurt to revisit these details, to examine kindness through the lens of suspicion, but it also felt honest. The truth, whatever it was, lived in specifics, not theories. Outside the investigation, the town had almost finished absorbing the case into its identity. New tragedies came and went. New headlines replaced old ones. But this story remained the reference point, the unresolved question people returned to when they talked about danger, about trust, about how quickly certainty can dissolve. It had become a caution passed down informally, stripped of dates and names, reduced to a feeling, be careful, even here. A potential break arrived in the form of a casual remark. Someone mentioned, offhand, a conversation years earlier, something that hadn't seemed important enough to report. A comment made in passing. A joke that landed wrong. At the time, it had been dismissed as awkwardness. Now, viewed through the accumulated weight of 6 years, it felt different. Darker. Intentional. Detectives followed up, gently at first, then with more focus. The person who'd made the remark brushed it off, claimed faulty memory. Memory again. Always memory. The pressure increased subtly. More frequent contact. More detailed questions. No accusations, just presence. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes the knowledge that you're being watched changes how you carry yourself. The person at the center of the renewed attention didn't panic, didn't lash out. He adjusted. Became more guarded. More precise. That shift was noted. Calm can be maintained. Control is harder. Internally, investigators argued again about whether they were circling the truth or chasing a shadow. Cold cases punish certainty. They reward patience, but they also devour it. Every step forward risked being the wrong one, the one that locked them into a narrative they couldn't escape. As the 6th anniversary passed, the case remained officially unsolved, but something fundamental had changed. The story no longer felt static. It felt tense. Like a held breath. The silence that had once seemed impenetrable now felt strained, stretched thin by time and scrutiny. And somewhere within that strain, the night itself waited, unchanged, uncompromised. The knock. The door. The choice. 6 years hadn't altered the facts. They had only reshaped the people around them. The one who knew the truth had carried it through thousands of ordinary days, through birthdays and routines and small talk, believing, perhaps, that survival meant success. But time has a way of turning survival into exposure. And the case, long frozen, was beginning to thaw. 7 years after the disappearance, the case reached a strange middle ground, no longer cold enough to be ignored, not warm enough to burn. It existed in that uncomfortable state where something feels close, but refuses to show itself, where intuition sharpens, but proof stays just out of reach. Investigators felt it in the way conversations changed, in the way certain names caused rooms to go quiet, in the way silence itself began to feel reactive rather than empty. The man who had surfaced repeatedly at the edges of the investigation was not named publicly, not labeled a suspect, but within the task force his presence was undeniable. His history was mapped in careful detail now. Where he had been living at the time. Who he spoke to regularly. What his routines looked like before and after the night she vanished. Patterns emerged that weren't dramatic, but they were consistent. Consistency can be comforting, but it can also be engineered. Detectives revisited the idea of opportunity, not motive. Motive can be invented. Opportunity cannot. They asked a simple question that hadn't been emphasized enough early on. Who could have been with her that night without raising alarm? Who could knock without fear? Who could enter without resistance? The list was short. Uncomfortably short. They returned to the knock. That detail had grown louder with time, not quieter. A knock is intentional. It implies patience. It implies confidence. You knock when you expect an answer. You knock when you believe the door will open. That single, soft sound reframed the entire case, shifting it away from chaos and toward calculation. Interviews became more focused. Less friendly. Still polite, but stripped of unnecessary warmth. The questions dug into routine, into habit, into what people remembered doing on an otherwise forgettable night years earlier. Some struggled genuinely. Others answered too easily. Too smoothly. The difference was subtle, but perceptible to trained ears. The man at the center of attention adjusted again. He asked fewer questions. Offered less information. He became careful with language, precise in a way that suggested preparation. That alone wasn't proof of anything, but it was a change, and changes mattered. People who have nothing to hide rarely rewrite themselves. Investigators tested pressure without revealing its source. They asked about unrelated events, minor conflicts, small favors. They watched reactions closely. A flicker of irritation here. A pause there. Nothing overt. Nothing explosive. Just enough to suggest that the ground beneath the story wasn't as solid as it appeared. Meanwhile, technology continued to close gaps time had once protected. Archived phone records were cross-referenced with newly digitized logs. The margins tightened again. A call placed, not answered. A device powered down for hours longer than usual. Nothing definitive, but the absence of activity spoke louder now than it once had. Silence was no longer neutral. It was contextual. The family was briefed carefully. No promises. No declarations. Just the truth as it stood, renewed focus, narrowed attention, cautious optimism. They listened quietly, having learned that hope must be rationed. Still, something shifted in the room. For the first time in years, the questions felt directional. Like they were pointing somewhere instead of spinning in place. Outside the investigation, the town felt the change without understanding it. Rumors stirred again, different this time, more restrained, less theatrical. People spoke in fragments. Half sentences. Warnings disguised as concern. The case had begun to feel personal again, close enough to unsettle routines that had grown comfortable around uncertainty. A new witness came forward, reluctantly. Someone who had never wanted to be involved. Someone who had convinced themselves their memory was irrelevant. They described a conversation, brief and awkward, shortly after the disappearance. A comment that suggested knowledge before knowledge was public. At the time, it had felt like nothing. Now, it felt heavy. Investigators verified the timing. It lined up too well to ignore. The man denied it, calmly, predictably. He said memories were unreliable, that grief distorts perception, that people want answers so badly they create them. He wasn't wrong. That's what made it dangerous. The truth and the excuse sounded too similar. Internally, the task force debated next steps. There was still no physical evidence tying anyone to a crime. No confession. No body. They were building a case out of alignment and behavior, out of silence and pattern. It was risky. It required patience. One wrong move could collapse everything. So they waited. They watched. They listened. They applied pressure indirectly, knowing that time, which had once been the suspect's greatest ally, might now be working against him. Lives change. Stress accumulates. Secrets grow heavier the longer they are carried. As the 7th anniversary passed, there were no public statements. No anniversaries marked on the news. Just a quiet understanding among those closest to the case that something was moving, slowly, deliberately. The case was no longer frozen. It was unstable. And beneath all of it, the night itself remained unchanged, the sequence intact, the truth complete and unaltered. 7 years of silence had not rewritten what happened after the door opened. They had only tested whether silence could hold indefinitely. Somewhere, someone believed it could. That belief was beginning to look like a mistake. 8 years in, the silence started to fracture, not loudly, not all at once, but with small, almost imperceptible cracks that only became visible if you stared at them long enough. Investigators had learned to do exactly that. They stopped looking for dramatic breaks and started watching for fatigue, for the tiny failures that come when a story has been carried too long. People can rehearse lies. They struggle to maintain them forever. The man who had become central to the investigation was contacted again, this time under a different pretext. Not the case. Not her name. Just routine follow-up on old records. The shift in approach was deliberate. When people think the danger has passed, they loosen their grip. His reaction was subtle but telling. He asked why now? Why after so many years? The question itself revealed something important. He had been counting. Investigators revisited his timeline with brutal precision. Not just where he claimed to be, but how he moved between places, how long those movements should have taken, what assumptions were embedded in his version of events. They compared it against traffic patterns, against weather data, against construction logs that showed a road closure he hadn't accounted for. The discrepancies were small. Minutes. But minutes mattered. Minutes are where decisions live. A second witness emerged, independent of the first, someone who had never spoken publicly, someone who had no interest in attention. They remembered seeing a familiar car near the apartment complex late that night, parked where it didn't usually park. At the time, it had barely registered. Familiarity dulls suspicion. Only later did the memory gain weight. The description wasn't perfect, but it aligned uncomfortably well. The task force didn't rush. They verified everything they could without alerting him. Quiet checks. Old photos. Registration records. Maintenance logs. A repair made weeks after the disappearance suddenly looked less routine, when placed next to a damaged tail light mentioned years earlier. It wasn't proof. But it was shape again. And shape was becoming structure. The family was informed cautiously. Still no promises. Still no conclusions. But the language had changed. Investigators spoke in firmer tones, avoided vague reassurances. They acknowledged momentum. That word carried both hope and fear. Momentum can carry you forward, or it can throw you off balance if mishandled. The town felt it too. Something had shifted in the air, subtle but undeniable. People noticed patrol cars lingering a little longer in certain areas. Not dramatic. Just enough to be noticed. Conversations lowered when names were mentioned. The case, long dormant in public life, had begun to stir again, and with it, the unease that had never truly gone away. The man noticed the attention. He became defensive without being aggressive, cautious without appearing alarmed. He updated his routines, changed small habits, avoided certain places. These adjustments were rational. Anyone would make them. But investigators noted the timing. Adjustments came after contact. After questions. After renewed interest. Not before. They brought him in again, this time for a longer conversation. No accusations. No confrontations. Just a careful walk through the past. He answered patiently, but the cracks widened. Details shifted. Minor inconsistencies appeared, not dramatic enough to confront, but too numerous to ignore. When corrected, he laughed them off. Memory, he said. Everyone's memory is flawed. But flawed memory doesn't usually get sharper over time. His did. Later versions of his story were more detailed than earlier ones, not less. That suggested reconstruction. Editing. An effort to improve a narrative after the fact. Investigators exchanged glances, but said nothing. Silence can be more unsettling than confrontation. They left him with uncertainty, deliberately. No closure. No reassurance. Just the sense that the past was no longer safely buried. Pressure works best when it's ambiguous. When you don't know how much is known, or what might come next. Behind the scenes, prosecutors were consulted, cautiously. The question was no longer if there was something there, but whether it could ever be proven. Circumstantial cases are fragile. They require patience and precision. One misstep can collapse years of work. The decision was made to continue building, to let time do what it does best, erode defenses. As the 8th year closed, the case stood on the edge of something it hadn't been near in a long time: direction. Not resolution. Not justice. But direction. The story was narrowing, shedding excess, focusing itself around a set of choices made on one quiet night. The knock. The door. The car parked where it didn't belong. The minutes that didn't add up. 8 years hadn't changed the truth. They had only changed who was still willing to carry it. 9 years after the disappearance, the case stopped feeling like a question and started feeling like a weight, something pressing down on everyone who touched it, shaping decisions, slowing movements, demanding care. Investigators were no longer asking whether a crime had occurred. That debate had quietly ended. The question now was narrower and more dangerous. Could they ever prove it without destroying the case entirely? The task force moved with restraint bordering on hesitation, Every action was calculated. Every phone call logged. Every conversation rehearsed internally before it happened. They understood how fragile the moment was. After nearly a decade, one wrong move could send the truth retreating back into silence forever. The man at the center of their attention was no longer just a person of interest in private discussion. He had become the axis around which the entire case rotated. Not officially. Not publicly. But functionally, everything pointed toward him. Opportunity aligned. Timelines strained. Witness memories, independent of one another, bent in the same direction. It was no longer coincidence. It was convergence. They studied his life in the years since the disappearance, not for guilt, but for erosion. Stress leaves marks. So does fear. So does the long-term effort of maintaining a version of events that must never collapse. Investigators noted periods of instability, relationships that ended abruptly, jobs that changed without clear explanation, moments where control slipped just enough to be noticed. Nothing criminal. Nothing obvious. Just pressure leaking through the seams. Another interview was scheduled, this time with a different tone entirely. Not confrontational, but firm. The kind of conversation that doesn't seek answers so much as it tests resilience. He arrived composed, polite, still confident in his ability to manage the narrative. But something had shifted. He asked more questions than before. What exactly were they looking for? Why were they revisiting this now? How long did they plan to keep doing this? Those questions mattered. Innocent people want resolution. Guilty ones want timelines. They walked him through his account again, slowly, deliberately, allowing him to speak uninterrupted. The story came out smoothly, practiced, familiar. Then they asked him to repeat it in reverse order. Small detail. Different cognitive demand. His cadence changed. He paused longer. Corrected himself more often. The story didn't collapse, but it wavered. Like a structure under strain. Investigators didn't pounce. They let the silence stretch. Silence forces people to fill it. He did, adding clarifications no one had asked for, tightening explanations that hadn't been challenged. When the interview ended, he left with a controlled smile that didn't reach his eyes. Outside the room, detectives compared notes quietly. They had seen enough to know the pressure was working. A third witness stepped forward weeks later, this one unexpected, this one impossible to ignore. Someone who had crossed paths with him briefly in the days after the disappearance, someone with no connection to the victim, no stake in the case. They described a moment that had lingered in their memory for years, a strange intensity, a comment that felt out of place, a reference to events that hadn't yet been public. At the time, it had meant nothing. Now, it felt heavy. Corroboration followed. Not perfect. Not clean. But enough to reinforce the pattern. Investigators felt the walls closing in, not dramatically, not with a crash, but steadily, brick by brick. The case was becoming less about finding something new and more about aligning what was already there. Prosecutors urged caution. Circumstantial cases demand discipline. Emotion can't lead. Narrative can't substitute for proof. They needed something anchoring. Something concrete. Without it, the risk of acquittal was high, and acquittal would be permanent. There would be no second chance. So investigators returned to the physical world. Not the apartment. Not the gas station. But the spaces in between. Routes. Shortcuts. Places someone might go in a moment of panic, or calculation. They searched again, not with volunteers and hope, but with technology and strategy. Ground-penetrating radar. Targeted sweeps. Focused zones based on narrowed timelines. Days passed. Then weeks. Then a call came in late one evening, quiet, controlled. Something had been found. Not definitive. Not identifiable yet. But enough to stop the room cold. Enough to justify further testing. Further excavation. Further restraint in what was said publicly. The man was contacted again. Not accused. Not arrested. Just informed that the investigation was continuing. His reaction was measured, but the control slipped this time, just for a moment. His voice tightened. His questions came faster. What did they find? Where? How much? Investigators gave nothing away. They didn't need to. The uncertainty did the work for them. The town sensed the tension immediately. Patrol activity increased. Familiar faces appeared at unfamiliar hours. The case, long dormant in public consciousness, began to stir again. People felt it without understanding why. Old fear resurfaced, sharper this time, edged with anticipation. The family was brought in privately. They were told only what they needed to know. Progress. Caution. Time. They listened in silence, hands clenched, hope pressing painfully against years of restraint. They had learned not to celebrate early. Still, something felt different. Heavier. More real. As the 9th year drew to a close, the case stood on the threshold it had been approaching for nearly a decade. The mystery had narrowed. The silence had thinned. The truth was no longer hidden by absence alone. It was protected now by timing, by law, by the careful balance between knowing and proving. And somewhere in the middle of that balance, the night itself waited, unchanged. The knock. The door. The choice that followed. 9 years was a long time to carry a secret. Long enough for cracks to form. Long enough for silence to become unbearable. And for the first time since that early morning phone call, the case felt like it might finally force an answer, not because time had revealed the truth, but because it had finally run out of places to hide it. The 10th year didn't arrive gently. It arrived with tension, with expectation, with the unspoken understanding that whatever happened next would define the case forever. 10 years was a psychological threshold. It changed how people thought, how they spoke, how they justified what they had done or failed to do. A decade is long enough for denial to harden into belief, long enough for a lie to feel like truth, long enough for someone to convince themselves they had survived what they did. Investigators felt the pressure from every direction. The evidence they had gathered was no longer thin, but it was still fragile, a structure built from inference, alignment, and behavior rather than certainty. The discovery from the previous search remained under analysis, sealed behind lab doors, its significance unknown but heavy. They waited for results that could change everything or change nothing at all, knowing both outcomes carried consequences. While they waited, they turned back to the man again, not aggressively, not publicly, but persistently. The strategy was no longer about catching him off guard. It was about exhausting the space he'd been hiding in. Every conversation, every interaction, every question was designed to shrink that space, to make the past unavoidable. They spoke to him about his life now. About stress. About how carrying unresolved things can erode a person. They framed it as concern, as understanding. Sometimes, the fastest way to the truth isn't accusation, it's permission. Permission to stop pretending. Permission to let something end. He listened carefully. Too carefully. His responses were measured, thoughtful, almost philosophical. He spoke about time, about how memory fades, about how people want neat answers even when none exist. It was articulate. Convincing. And deeply unsettling. He wasn't afraid of the case anymore. He was tired of it. That tiredness showed in small ways. He missed appointments. Returned calls late. Asked questions he hadn't asked before. What happens when a case goes this long, he wondered aloud. Do they ever really close? Or do they just circle forever? Investigators noted the language. Closing. Forever. Circling. Words chosen carefully still reveal intention. The lab results came back incomplete. Inconclusive. Not the answer they needed, but not a dead end either. The material couldn't be definitively identified yet, but it warranted further testing, more advanced methods, more time. Time again. Always time. The thing everyone had too much of and not enough of at once. Prosecutors reviewed the case again, more seriously this time. They laid out scenarios, weighed risks, imagined courtrooms and cross-examinations. They knew what the defense would argue. No body. No confession. Memories distorted by time. Circumstantial evidence dressed up as certainty. The burden was immense. Justice, they reminded everyone, is not about belief. It's about proof. So investigators continued building, methodically, patiently, aware that the case might hinge on one moment of weakness rather than one dramatic discovery. People don't always confess because of evidence. Sometimes they confess because they are done. Done carrying it. Done defending it. Done pretending it never happened. The family marked the 10th anniversary privately. No media. No statements. Just a gathering, subdued, heavy with everything that had been lost. 10 years without answers is its own kind of sentence. They spoke her name softly, carefully, like saying it too loudly might hurt. They didn't ask when anymore. They asked how. How someone could vanish and leave such a void. How a town could move on while they stayed suspended. The town itself felt the weight of the decade. Stories resurfaced. Old conversations were retold with new emphasis. People re-examined their own memories, wondering what they'd overlooked, what they'd dismissed. 10 years changes perspective. Things that once seemed irrelevant now felt charged. Suspicious. Too neat. Too quiet. Investigators reopened one final line of inquiry, one they had avoided because of how invasive it was. They began re-interviewing people not as witnesses, but as participants in a shared environment. Not what did you see, but how did you feel? Not what do you remember, but what did you assume? Assumptions are powerful. They shape what people report and what they ignore. A conversation from years earlier came back into focus. Someone recalled a moment they hadn't thought about in a long time, a fleeting interaction, a tension that hadn't made sense until now. They hadn't reported it because it felt subjective. Now, paired with everything else, it mattered. It didn't stand alone. It fit. The man was contacted again. This time, the tone was unmistakably different. Still calm. Still professional. But no longer neutral. He was informed that the case was approaching a decision point. That investigators were moving toward resolution, one way or another. That the opportunity to speak freely would not last forever. He reacted with controlled frustration. Asked if they were threatening him. They said no. They were informing him. Silence followed. The kind of silence that stretches, presses, demands something in return. He broke it by asking a single question, barely above a whisper. What happens if someone talks now? No one answered directly. They didn't have to. The implication hung there, heavy, unavoidable. Talking changes things. Silence preserves them. For better or worse. After that meeting, his behavior shifted more noticeably. Sleep issues. Irritability. A visible edge that hadn't been there before. Investigators knew these signs well. Pressure doesn't always produce truth, but it always produces reaction. And reaction was what they needed. Behind the scenes, preparations began. Quietly. Contingencies. Warrants drafted but not executed. Strategies mapped out depending on what came next. The case was no longer drifting. It was approaching impact. As the 10th year drew to a close, there was no announcement, no declaration of victory or failure. Just a shared understanding among those closest to the investigation that the endgame had begun. The mystery that had haunted the town for a decade was no longer an abstract absence. It was a confrontation waiting to happen. The knock had echoed for 10 years. The door had never really closed. And the choice made that night, the one that had changed everything, was about to demand its price, whether the person who made it was ready or not. 10 years is a long time to outrun the truth. Long enough to believe you've succeeded. And just long enough to forget how heavy it becomes when it finally stops running with you. The first crack didn't come with sirens or headlines. It came quietly, buried in paperwork and late-night calls, the kind of development that doesn't feel real until it refuses to be ignored. An analyst flagged the updated lab results as soon as they landed. This time, the language was different. Careful, restrained, but unmistakably firmer than before. Consistent with. Not definitive. Not absolute. But no longer dismissible. The material recovered from the search matched what investigators had long suspected it might. The odds of coincidence were shrinking. Not enough to declare victory, but enough to shift the balance. Enough to change how prosecutors leaned back in their chairs when they read the report. Enough to make silence feel riskier than action. Investigators met behind closed doors. No speculation. No dramatics. Just a sober assessment of what they had and what they still needed. The case was no longer theoretical. It had weight now. Texture. A trajectory. The question was no longer if something had happened, but how much could be proven and how. They returned to timelines. Always the timelines. This time, they weren't looking for gaps. They were looking for pressure points. Moments where stories bent. Where memory wavered. Where choices were made quickly and later justified slowly. They mapped behavior against stress, against opportunity, against fear. One night stood out more clearly than ever. Not because it was loud or chaotic, but because it was quiet in ways that no longer made sense. Too quiet. Too clean. The kind of quiet that only exists when someone is very careful, or very practiced. They began reconstructing that night minute by minute, using everything from cell tower pings to weather records, from receipts to power usage data. Tiny details. The kind people assume vanish with time. They don't. Technology had changed in the years since the case began. Methods once considered impossible were now routine. Old data was reprocessed with new tools, new eyes, new assumptions. Something overlooked years earlier surfaced, not as a revelation, but as confirmation. A pattern that had always been there, waiting for someone to see it differently. The man was called in again. This time, there was no pretense of casual conversation. No gentle easing into questions. The tone was still controlled, but the space between words felt narrower, sharper. He noticed immediately. His posture changed. His answers shortened. He asked fewer questions of his own. They told him they were closer now. That the case had evolved. That some things couldn't be undone. They didn't show him everything. They didn't need to. They showed him just enough to let his imagination do the rest. People often fear what they think investigators know more than what they actually do. His breathing changed. Not dramatically. Subtly. But it changed. He pushed back, calmly at first. Pointed out the years that had passed. The lack of a body. The absence of witnesses. He sounded confident, rehearsed, like someone reciting a speech they'd refined over a long time. Investigators let him talk. People reveal more when they believe they're defending themselves successfully. Then he slipped. Not with a confession. Not with an admission. With a detail no one had mentioned. A sequence of events that hadn't been raised in the room. Something he shouldn't have known to clarify unless he had replayed that night many times, from the inside. The room didn't react. Not immediately. Investigators are trained for this moment. To let it pass like nothing happened. To allow the person speaking to keep going, unaware they'd stepped beyond the line. He did. For several minutes. Each sentence tightening the knot he didn't realize he'd begun tying around himself. When the interview ended, he looked drained. Not angry. Not relieved. Just hollowed out, like someone who'd been carrying something heavy and suddenly felt how tired his arms were. He asked if he was free to go. They said yes. For now. Outside, he stood longer than necessary before getting into his car. Hands on the roof. Head down. Breathing slowly. A posture that suggested he knew something had shifted, even if he couldn't name it yet. Inside, investigators replayed the recording. Again. And again. The slip was real. Subtle, but real. Prosecutors were called. Urgently. They listened in silence, faces unreadable. When it ended, no one spoke for a long moment. That was the moment the case crossed an invisible line. The decision wasn't made lightly. Arrests like this, after so long, with so much history, carry enormous risk. But so does waiting. Memories fade, yes. But courage does too. And whatever resolve the man had relied on for years was showing signs of erosion. They began drafting the warrant. Meanwhile, word spread quietly among the family that something was happening. Not details. Just the sense that movement was finally underway. They didn't celebrate. They didn't hope too loudly. Hope had hurt them before. But they felt it, cautiously, like touching a bruise to see if it still ached. The town sensed it too. That familiar tension returned. Conversations hushed when certain names came up. People checked the news more often. Rumors surfaced, sharpened, contradicted. Everyone had a theory. Everyone had always had one. Now, those theories felt closer to being tested. The man noticed the change. He wasn't told about the warrant, but he felt the shift in how people looked at him. How conversations ended more quickly. How invitations stopped coming. Isolation crept in, slow and suffocating. The walls that had protected him for years were closing, not violently, but inevitably. On the morning the warrant was approved, no one smiled. There was no sense of triumph. Only gravity. This was the point of no return. Whatever happened next would define the case forever, either as justice finally served, or as a failure that could never be undone. They moved quickly, deliberately, before doubt or delay could interfere. The knock came early. Firm. Official. Unmistakable. 10 years after the first unanswered questions. 10 years after a choice had been made in the dark. The door opened. And for the first time since that night, there was nowhere left to step back into. The arrest didn't come with shouting or flashing lights. It came with routine efficiency, the kind that feels almost cruel in its normalcy. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as the man was guided into the back of an unmarked vehicle, hand steady, expression unreadable. Some recognized him immediately. Others only later, when the news alerts lit up their phones and a name long whispered suddenly became public. The headline spread fast. Faster than anyone expected. Faster than the official statements could keep up with. Ohio 2000 cold case solved. The word solved hit the town like a shockwave. People repeated it out loud, testing whether it sounded real. Solved meant answers. Solved meant an ending. Solved meant the long, aching uncertainty might finally release its grip. Inside the interrogation room, time slowed. The man sat alone for several minutes before anyone spoke to him. No rush. No pressure. Silence has weight, and investigators know how to use it. When they finally entered, they didn't accuse him. They didn't threaten. They laid out the facts calmly, one by one, like placing stones on a table until the surface disappeared beneath them. He listened. Closely. They talked about the lab results. The timelines. The inconsistencies in his statements over the years. They played the audio from the last interview, stopping it at the moment of the slip. They let the room sit with that sound, the echo of his own voice betraying him. He shook his head. Slowly. As if disappointed, not in them, but in himself. He denied it again. Of course he did. People rarely abandon their story at the beginning. Confession is not a switch. It's a process. And this one had been building for decades. Investigators pressed, gently but relentlessly, revisiting details he had once brushed aside. Why did he go there that night? Why did he leave when he did? Why did no one see him, yet so many remembered him being around? His answers grew thinner. Less confident. He paused more often, searching for words that had once come easily. He asked for water. He rubbed his hands together. He looked at the door more than once, as if measuring the distance. Then they brought in something new. Not evidence, emotion. They talked about the victim. Not as a case file. As a person. They described her routines. Her habits. The small details only someone who had studied her life carefully would know. The music she liked. The plans she'd made for the following week. The people who never stopped waiting for her. Something in him shifted. His shoulders dropped slightly. His jaw tightened. For the first time, his eyes filled, not with tears, but with something close. Regret, maybe. Or exhaustion. Or the realization that the story he had been telling himself was no longer enough to hold back the truth pressing in from all sides. He asked how much they knew. They answered honestly. Not everything. But enough. The room went quiet again. Longer this time. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower. Rougher. He didn't say the word confess. He didn't say I did it. Instead, he said something else. Something small. Something devastating. I never meant for it to go that far. That was it. That was the moment. From there, the narrative unraveled quickly. Not neatly. Not cleanly. But inevitably. He talked about fear. About panic. About a single decision that cascaded into many. He described the night in fragments, skipping over parts, lingering on others, as if even now he couldn't bear to look at the whole thing directly. There was no dramatic outburst. No cinematic breakdown. Just a steady release, like air leaking from a tire that had been overinflated for too long. Investigators guided him, clarified details, anchored his statements to the evidence they had. Each confirmation tightened the case, locking his words into a framework that could no longer be dismissed as speculation. Outside the room, prosecutors prepared. Charges were formalized. Documents filed. Timelines finalized. The machinery of justice, dormant for years, roared back to life. News outlets scrambled to update their stories, revising language, adding details, chasing reactions. The word solved now carried weight. Proof. Consequence. The family was notified privately. They gathered together before reading the official statement, bracing themselves for whatever it contained. Some cried. Some didn't. Grief doesn't follow rules. Relief and sorrow tangled together, impossible to separate. Answers, it turned out, didn't heal everything. They simply changed the shape of the pain. In town, reactions were mixed. Shock. Anger. Vindication. Guilt. People replayed old conversations in their heads, wondering what they'd missed, what they'd ignored, what they'd assumed couldn't possibly be true. The idea that someone so familiar could carry such a secret unsettled them more than the crime itself. At the courthouse, cameras waited. The man was led inside, head down, avoiding the crowd. He looked smaller now. Less solid. The weight he had carried alone was now public, and it showed. When the charges were read, the room remained silent. No gasps. No murmurs. Just the dull thud of finality settling in. The judge set a date. Proceedings moved forward. The system, slow and imperfect, did what it was designed to do. For investigators, there was no celebration. Just a deep, collective exhale. A case that had followed them for years, that had crept into their thoughts at night and refused to let go, was finally closing. But closure is a complicated word. Evidence would still be examined. Statements scrutinized. Defense strategies prepared. Nothing was guaranteed until the end. And even then, the past would remain. What happened couldn't be undone. A life lost could not be returned. As night fell on the town, lights flicked on in homes where the television stayed tuned to the same channel. People listened. They remembered. They tried to reconcile the story they had lived with the one now unfolding. Somewhere, in a cell designed for temporary holding, the man sat alone again. This time, the silence was different. No longer a shield. No longer a strategy. Just an empty space where the truth finally had room to breathe. The case was no longer cold. But its shadow, long and dark, would linger for years to come. The trial didn't begin with drama. It began with waiting. Long, suffocating waiting, the kind that stretches minutes into hours and turns every footstep in a hallway into a possible signal that something irreversible is about to happen. Outside the courthouse, the air felt heavier than usual, thick with expectation and unease. Cameras lined the steps, reporters rehearsed lines they'd already said 100 times, and the town, this quiet Ohio town that had carried a secret for decades, held its breath. Inside, the man sat at the defense table, flanked by attorneys who spoke to him in low, urgent whispers. He nodded occasionally, but his eyes drifted. He wasn't looking at the judge. He wasn't looking at the jury pool filing in one by one. He was staring at nothing, or maybe at something only he could see. The past has a way of resurfacing at moments like this, uninvited and relentless. Across the room, the prosecution organized stacks of paper, digital displays, timelines refined to the minute. Years of work distilled into exhibits and statements, each one a small piece of a puzzle that had once seemed impossible to complete. There was no gloating in their posture. Just focus. Precision. The understanding that this was the only chance they would get. Jury selection took days. Each question peeled back assumptions, biases, memories of headlines read years ago. Some potential jurors admitted they already had opinions. Others claimed they knew nothing at all, a statement met with quiet skepticism. In a town like this, knowledge travels even when people pretend it doesn't. Eventually, 12 were chosen. 12 strangers tasked with carrying the weight of a story that had haunted an entire community. Opening statements landed hard. The prosecution spoke first, their voice steady, deliberate. They didn't exaggerate. They didn't need to. They laid out the arc of the case like a slow burn, starting with the disappearance, the unanswered questions, the years of silence. They talked about evidence that had waited patiently for technology to catch up. About a man who had inserted himself into the narrative early and never truly left it. About fear masquerading as normal life. The defense followed, pushing back immediately. They emphasized time. Decades of it. They pointed to missing elements, to uncertainty, to the absence of a body. They framed the case as a tragedy compounded by desperation, suggesting investigators had forced the evidence to fit a theory born of frustration rather than fact. Reasonable doubt became their mantra, repeated until the words lost their shape. Then the witnesses began. Investigators took the stand first, walking the jury through the early days of the case. Grainy photos. Old maps. Notes written by hands that had long since retired or passed away. They spoke about dead ends, about hope rising and falling, about the moment they realized the case would not let them go. Their voices betrayed nothing, but their eyes did. This wasn't just a job. It had never been just a job. Forensic experts followed, translating science into language the jury could hold on to. They explained how samples once deemed unusable had been re-examined. How probability narrowed. How chance gave way to near certainty. The defense challenged every conclusion, dissecting margins of error, suggesting alternative explanations. The experts didn't flinch. They had expected this. Science, after all, is built to be questioned. Then came the civilians. Friends. Neighbors. People who had lived alongside both the victim and the accused without realizing the connection that would eventually bind them in court. Some testified with trembling voices, others with controlled detachment. They talked about routines, about changes they noticed only in hindsight. About moments that seemed insignificant at the time, but now felt loaded with meaning. One witness paused mid-sentence, overwhelmed. The courtroom waited as they gathered themselves, the silence stretching thin. When they continued, their words landed heavier than before. Grief, delayed but undiminished, filled the room. No one looked away. The most anticipated moment came quietly. The recording was played. Not the full confession, there wasn't one, but the interview. The slip. The detail that had tipped the scales. The jury leaned forward as the audio crackled to life, listening carefully, searching for what they'd been told to hear. When it came, it was subtle. A phrase out of place. A clarification unprompted. The kind of thing easily missed if you weren't listening for it. But once heard, it couldn't be unheard. The defense objected. The judge overruled. The moment stayed. When the man finally took the stand, the room felt different. Charged. Expectant. He spoke slowly, choosing words with care, as if each one might detonate if handled incorrectly. He denied intent. He denied malice. He spoke of confusion, of pressure, of a night spiraling beyond control. He framed himself as someone who had lived with regret rather than guilt. Cross-examination was surgical. The prosecution didn't raise their voice. They didn't accuse. They asked questions that circled back on themselves, tightening with each pass. Timelines were revisited. Statements compared. Contradictions laid bare without commentary. The man's composure held, until it didn't. His answers shortened. His explanations blurred. He corrected himself once, then twice. The jury watched everything. By the time closing arguments arrived, exhaustion hung over the courtroom like fog. Weeks of testimony had taken their toll. The prosecution spoke last, their words measured but firm. They didn't promise certainty. They promised clarity. They asked the jury to look at the case not as isolated pieces, but as a whole. To consider what made sense, and what didn't. Deliberation took longer than anyone expected. Hours passed. Then days. Outside, speculation ran wild. Inside, the jury weighed each detail, replayed testimony, argued quietly behind closed doors. The town waited again, suspended in a familiar state of anxious anticipation. The kind that had defined it for years. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom filled fast. The man stood as the verdict was read. His face betrayed nothing, but his hands trembled slightly at his sides. The words echoed through the room, each one landing with finality. Not everyone reacted the same way. Some wept. Some closed their eyes. Some stared straight ahead, absorbing the sound of justice, however imperfect, finally spoken aloud. Sentencing would come later. For now, there was only the verdict, heavy and irrevocable. As the courtroom emptied, people spoke in hushed tones. Outside, microphones waited again, but many passed them by. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said over the course of 20 years. The case was no longer a question. But answers, it turned out, were only the beginning of a different kind of reckoning.